Okay, so we're live now. So welcome everyone. Dear colleagues and friends, my name is Nihira Ram and I'm with the online events team at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. Welcome to the webinar titled Impact of COVID-19 on Employment in the Informal Sector. This webinar was organized by the Pandemic Studies Unit of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. I begin by requesting the director of the foundation, Sandeepan Bakshi, to start the event's proceedings and welcome everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Nihira. And hi, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the globe you are joining us today at this point. On behalf of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, I welcome you all who are joining us today in the Zoom room or watching this event through our Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter platforms. Uh, the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, or FAS, as many of you would know, is a charitable trust based in India and established in 2003. Elsewhere in less developed countries, we do so, in the form of a network, an association with a wide section of people, researchers, scholars, working in different academic institutions and research institutes, universities across the country and globe. I'm happy today to announce that this is the first event for, it is our first event for 2021, and on a subject that continues to be relevant, the impact of COVID-19 on aspects of Indian economy. It is a mark of the deep and multifaceted effect that the pandemic has had on life, production, and work. Unsurprisingly, it was this realization that the realization that the pandemic will continue to play out in our socio-economic life for a longer term, that the foundation established a pandemic studies unit in the second half of 2020, an endeavor that would not have been possible without the constant support of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, who are also supporting this panel discussion today. The FAS Pandemic Studies Unit, Nihira, if you could please put on the web page of the Pandemic Studies Unit. Yeah, so thank you. The Pandemic Studies Unit aims to study specifically the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on agriculture production, non-agriculture work in rural India, rural employment, including issues of women's work, food security and agriculture and rural development policy. We have now consolidated the work of the Pandemic Studies Unit in a web page that is visible on your screen. This panel discussion today is yet another event under the broad rubric of this study unit that will contribute to the deliberation on the effect of COVID-19 on the work and employment in the informal sector, a sector that perhaps has fared the worst. We have a very able panel today, a very eminent panel today to discuss the topic, and the discussion will be chaired by Dr. Surbhi Kesar, a scholar on the informal economy of India. Surbhi is an assistant professor of economics at the Center for Sustainable Employment at the Azim Premji University, Bangalore. Her research interests include political economy, development economics, labor economics, particularly informality, exclusion, and structural transformation, as well as capitalist transition in labor surplus economies. She has been consistently working, researching, and writing on the informal sector. In fact, she, along with a team of scholars at the Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University, is studying the impact of COVID-19 on livelihoods in India, which focuses on informality and vulnerability. So let me not waste your time any longer and call upon Surbhi to introduce the topic and the panelists. Dr. Surbhi. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that kind invitation and introduction. So I'm delighted to chair today's panel on the impact of COVID-19 on employment in the informal sector, which is organized by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies. And today on the panel, we have Professor Jayan Thomas, Professor Arun Dundas, and Professor Shamsher Singh. Before I set out the context for the panel, I would like to briefly introduce the speakers for today's panel. First up, we have Professor Jayan Thomas, who's an associate professor of economics at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and a member of the Kerala State Planning Board. His research interests include various aspects of Indian development, especially issues related to labor, industrialization, and the macroeconomy. And he teaches courses on macroeconomics, Indian economic development, and international economics. And today he'll be speaking on COVID-19 and the informal sector. The next panelist that we have today is Arun Dundas, who's a joint director of FAS and currently heads the project on agrarian relations in India. He works with household level primary data and macro level secondary data. He has collaborated with national and international scholars and has published book chapters and journal articles. His areas of interest are socioeconomic classes, rural income, wages, labor, rural farm and non-farm employment, and cultivation costs and prices. And today he'll be speaking on rural employment and wages. Finally, on the panel today, we have Dr. Shamsher Singh, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Flame University. Other than being involved in collecting and processing primary data, he has contributed to preparing several manuals like Household Survey Training Manual for Investigators, Manual for Organizing Village Study, Data Entry, and Manual for Calculating Household Incomes. And he has presented his work at various national and international academic forums. And today he will be speaking on a very pertinent issue, which is the migrant workers in the post-COVID era. Before I pass on the floor or the Zoom to the panelists, I would like to briefly set the context for today's discussion. As I imagine, the audience today would know that the Indian labor market is predominantly an informal or has, predominantly informal nature. Now, just to kind of set things in perspective, informal economy can be seen as broadly comprising of two components. One, it could be the petty, small-scale production units mainly operated based on household-based family work and are mainly subsistence-driven, as opposed to, let's say, accumulation-driven formal sector employment. And the second component is the informal wage employment. Now, this is basically employment that could be in both formal as well as informal units or enterprises, but is characterized by a lack of job contracts, social security benefits, think in terms of casual wage, construction workers, etc. Overall, the informal economy is widely characterized by precariously low earnings and lack of decent work conditions. The expectation, however, in much of the mainstream as well as parts of heterodox literature has been that with high economic growth, there would be a withering away of the informal sector and a formalization of the economy while providing secure livelihoods to the working population. Indian economy, however, despite experiencing a sustained period of high economic growth for almost 3 decades, has failed to make this transition or shift. Over the past decade or more, even the wage employment in the large-scale formal enterprises has become increasingly informalized. Think about the sanitation jobs, which have been outsourced and increasingly contractualized. Now, given this absence of, social security in the jobs, and given this huge informal economy, it becomes a crucial site of vulnerabilities and precarity. Now, when such an economy is faced with such a huge economic shock, be it the pandemic or the subsequent lockdown, it is almost expected that the informal workforce, which is the overwhelming majority of the Indian workforce, is likely to be gravely impacted. And that's exactly what happened. Research that Dr. Sandeepan was talking about right now that we've been doing with the Center for Sustainable Employment with Amit Basoli, Rosa Abraham, and other colleagues have, we show that basically there was much higher loss in employment for these informal workers. And given the absence of social security nets in the country, it soon translated to widespread hunger for the vulnerable population. While there was a need for high level of fiscal support, which has been severely short, and that is something that could have redressed this to some extent. However, I think it's also important to remember that when we speak about this loss during the lockdown, we need to contextualize it in terms of the already existing vulnerabilities in the Indian economy, in terms of this huge informality, which decades of policy making have not managed to address. Post-lockdown, we are seeing another peculiar phenomenon drawing out from the CMI data, where our research is showing a further shift towards informality, away from salaried jobs and away from formal employment. Now, this juncture, therefore, on one hand, posits the need of how to redress this impact of the pandemic on informality and the resultant hunger and food insecurities. But on the other hand, this juncture also presents the need to radically rethink India's development trajectory that has failed to deliver secure livelihoods for the vast majority of the working population, even prior to the pandemic. It is in this context that I would like to situate today's panel discussion. And on that note, I would request Professor Jayan Thomas to please make his presentation. Thank you. Professor Thomas, you will have to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And just some housekeeping rules that each panelist will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, after which we'll open the floor for discussions and questions. So thank you. Over to you.
Friends, I hope my screen is visible. So I would like to speak about, so thank you, Surbhi, and thank you also Foundation for Agrarian Studies for this opportunity to speak about employment in the informal sector in India. I would like to organize my comments broadly into around 2 points. One is on what has been the record so far, and two, what must be done, what should be done, the way forward. So on the first point, what has been the record, I would kind of agree with Surbhi that the employment growth record in the Indian economy was quite dismal even before the pandemic struck early last year. It's quite, I mean, I think this is quite well known. The rise in unemployment has been much discussed, both in the media as well as in the policy circles. But I would also probably like to just highlight certain facts, certain aspects of the employment challenge that India faces, which may not be so well known. So again, based mainly on official employment statistics, the national sample surveys, as well as the PLFS, which were published in 2017-18 and 2018-19. So one aspect I want to highlight is the employment challenge in India has actually, there's been a deepening of the challenge after 2011-2012. Second is that during the period from 2012, or the period from 2012 to 2018, the crisis has hit rural areas and informal enterprises much more than urban areas and formal enterprises. And the record is somewhat quite different from the record during the period from 2005 to 2012, where in fact it was the rural areas which benefited from employment growth in construction, mainly in rural areas of states such as Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. The third point I want to emphasize is during the years after 2012, the workers who have been hit the hardest are young workers, especially young workers, including young male workers, and women both young and old. Sorry, next one. This has to be understood against the larger structural context in India, both growth of employment or growth of what I may describe as the potential supply of workers to non-agricultural sectors, that is to industry and services, and the demand for these potential workers. So the supply, what are the factors which affect supply? One clearly is the increase in working age population, what is often described as the demographic dividend, which is also an opportunity for the country, very well, we all know. But two, there's been a shift of the workforce, which is very natural part of any development process, workforce away from agriculture. That's what you see. There's been an absolute decline in agricultural employment starting from 2004-05 onwards, due to both push factors as well as pull factors. And third is, Third is some changes in the nature of the workforce. One one big factor there is the rise in enrollment in educational institutions, which means workers have greater aspirations about their jobs, which also mean that disguised unemployment in agriculture is probably no longer an option. I hope I'm so far, I'm audible enough and that my slides are moving. Sandeepan?
Yes.
Thank you, Surbhi. So just to look at what has been happening as per the official, as per our analysis based on official employment statistics. So we said supply of potential workers in the non-agricultural sectors, that is partly due to increase in working age population, partly due to people moving out of agriculture. So we have some amount of workers ready to join the workforce. But what about the demand for such workers, demand for such labor? We find, based on the data, that the two main areas where labor could be employed, manufacturing and construction. Look at the employment in manufacturing in India. It was around 56 million in 2005, increased to 61 million in 2012. But from 2012, there's not been any increase, but actually a decline by almost 1 million. So 2012 and 2018, employment in manufacturing, this is both formal and informal manufacturing employment, has actually declined. And we find that much of this employment decline has been in the informal sector, in micro and small industry. So that is the point we want to make here. After 2012, the crisis has been more in the informal sector, not so much in the formal sector. Look at construction. In fact, this has been the prime source of employment during the period from 2005 to 2012. Already mentioned how it benefited rural employment opportunities in Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, UP, and Rajasthan. Almost 19 million new jobs were created in that 7-year period, 2005 to 2012. But just look at the period after that, 2012 to 2018, from 19 million, it reduced to less than 2 million new rural jobs in construction. So big, sharp decline in construction jobs there. The only, the only sector where employment growth actually happened was in services. On the one hand, education and health. In fact, this is the only area where women found employment. Much of this new employment was as relatively low wage employment as ASHA workers or Anganwadi teachers. But there was also increase in employment in a range of professional, scientific, technical, and business services. So this has been the case. We just looked at the potential supply of workers and the demand for these workers. What we find, so this is even before the COVID struck, what we find is that there's been a deepening mismatch in India. Even during the 2005 to 2012 period, which I mentioned as a period of better growth, in terms of what was the report? The potential supply of labor in industry, construction, and services increased at the rate of 14 million a year. In fact, Indian economy needed to create that many jobs, not in agriculture, but outside agriculture. But the actual job creation was around 6 million a year. So there was a big gap. But look at the supply demand mismatch in the period after that, 2012 to 2018. The potential supply of labor in industry, construction, and services increased at the rate of 17.5 million a year. But the actual job creation in these sectors was much less, 4.5 million a year. So deepening mismatch between these two. And what was it? What did it mean to men and women in India? I'm just looking at two segments. One, young men, aged 15 to 29 years. Look at their distribution. Hope you can see the cursor moving. Let's say out of every 100 young men in 2005, 33 were engaged in agriculture in 2005. By 2018, only 15 were engaged in agriculture. But has industry, construction, and services created enough jobs for them? No. those engaged in industry, construction and services actually declined from 37 to 34, which meant that there was a very large increase in unemployment among the young men. 4 out of 100 in 2005 to almost 11 out of 100 in 2018. Another segment is women, young women aged 15 to 29 years. Here the situation is, out of every 100 women, young women in this age group, almost 24 were engaged in agriculture in 2005, only 6 were engaged in agriculture in 2018. There was no increase in non-agricultural employment. Industry, construction and services employed 10 in 2005, 7 in 2018. So what happened to the rest? In fact, what happened was many of these women, these are young women, many of them educated women who could potentially have been in the labor force. But what we find is a very large number of them, 46 in 2005, 52 in 2018, reporting their status as outside the labor force, attending to domestic duties. So this has been the situation even before the COVID struck. So we had an employment challenge. And post-COVID, we have some of the studies which are already mentioned. In fact, the two institutions, Foundation for Agrarian Studies as well as Azim Premji University, they have done very good work on this. So I think this clearly, one paper which Rosa, Amit, and Surbhi did showed how, based on CMI data, showed how, almost 16% of those who were employed in December 2019 were not employed or were without a job in August 2020. So clearly, there were job losses. There were also rising insecurity. And there was an article in Review of Agrarian Studies which looked at the case of ASHA workers. There are in fact many more studies, but I'm just showing just 2 of these as what may have happened. So let me just speak a little bit about what must be done now, given the situation now. I believe that what is required is a wage-led growth for the Indian economy. It's very clear from our demand structure. If you look at it, there are clearly both macro factors as well as sector-specific factors which point to such a demand wage-led growth for India. Our investment as a share of GDP has been declining over time. And very little prospects for an export-led growth at this stage. So what is required is a wage-led growth, and it must be made clear, cutting wages is not the way forward. In fact, one argument which has been quite prominent in recent times is to cut wages. It could be in the form of labor market reforms which increase working hours without actually increasing the wages, which effectively is reducing the real wages. But that is certainly not the way forward, because cutting wages will only shrink markets further. What we really need now is to enlarge the size of the markets. We really need to raise the consumption of and investment for the poor, because in fact propensity to consume is significantly higher for the poor. We should make use of that. I already mentioned the case of investment being very low in Indian economy. If World Bank data shows how 2008 India's investment rates were quite high. As much as high as the Chinese rate. But after 2012, the crisis that we face is partly an investment crisis. Partly also, as was mentioned by the previous by Surbhi, how small enterprises, just look at one indicator. There are many indicators, but just look at the red line. Credit as a share of the total credit to small, micro and small industries as a share of the total credit, how it is declining over time, right from 1991, even after 2014, 2012, there's been a decline even further. So we need wage-led growth, but what exactly? How exactly, and who are the vulnerable workers whose wages must be replenished? if we just look at the distribution of our workforce, we find casual workers accounting for casual workers almost 100 plus million. Regular workers, again, 24% of the workforce. Almost 50% of these regular workers are without any form of social security. Then we have self-employed in the non-agricultural sectors. This graph must also be useful just looking at share in the workforce and share in the wage bill. So I mean, look at female workers. They account for 23% of all workers in India in 2018, but their share in the wage bill is only around 14%. Same for all casual workers, men and women combined, 24% share in workforce, only less than 13% is the share in wage bill. So in fact, one must remember an argument made by Amartya Sen in the context of how to avert famines. He argued, the best way to avert famines is to replenish or recreate the incomes of the poor, because so as he also argued that the incomes of the poor are only a small share of the national income, and therefore it's actually very easy to recreate the incomes of the poor, and that's what we find here. Many of the vulnerable sections of the workforce, their incomes are already too low. So it's quite, it's very important as a first step. It's important to recreate these incomes. I made this calculation. Incomes lost by the vulnerable sections of India's workforce amounted to, during the first 2 months of the lockdown only, amounted to as much as 4 lakh crores or 2% of the country's annual GDP. So a key priority for any government program to revive the economy should be a restoration of at least a part of these lost incomes. I am clearly, just few last words. Clearly, the way forward is public investment that can help, great equitable development, infrastructure development, innovation. We need a new development model that is dispersed far and wide across the country and not centered in a few big cities. We need technologies that can create employment, not technologies which tend to displace labor. Think of, for instance, food processing industries or affordable housing in rural areas, the multiplier effects of which will be very high. Just want a last slide. I actually want to end this with some positive note. In fact, I visited Kerala, a few days back, and we did some field work. With one of my colleagues, Dr. Jayan J, we did some work among the migrant workers in Kerala. And one thing we were quite surprised to find is that many of the sectors in which migrant workers are employed, migrant workers means workers from other states, mainly from West Bengal, from Assam. Many of these migrant workers have returned to the state, and many of them, in fact, a large number of them came in flights. Because that actually shows the amount of revival in the economy and clearly the demand for new labor. I think it also has to do with government intervention in the economy. I already mentioned income losses among the poor. It was indeed remarkable that Kerala had announced an economic relief package amounting to 20,000 crores, which was large and early enough to cover the income losses in the state in the weeks that followed. So this is just one example of what intervention by the government can do to avert a crisis of livelihood in the Indian economy. Thank you so much. I will wait for more comments, and I'll try to come back in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Jayan Thomas. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'm sure, including myself, there are a lot of questions that we would like to engage with. I mean, especially the issue about mismatch between demand and supply of labor and how the mismatch has continued to increase, and this need to focus on wage-led growth, which apparently doesn't seem to be a central focus in the imagination of the current policymakers. And that just reminds me to just kind of make this point that in our survey we actually find that around there was a huge unmet demand even in Narega. So there's labor who's demanding work, which is not being met. And there is, in fact, demand for consumption goods, which is seen because there is a lot of hunger. So this Right for Food campaign is coming up with this hunger watch report, which has these fascinating numbers of what the proportion of India that is, I mean, the proportion of the sample that's still going to bed hungry and have not been able to match to their pre-pandemic levels of food consumption. So there's this clear demand for work, and there's this clear demand for consumption goods, and that goes in just goes in tandem with what you're talking about in terms of higher public investment, in terms of producing jobs for these kind of workers who also have a higher propensity to consume and spend, and therefore kicking in the multiplier much quicker in the economy. So yeah, thanks for fascinating presentation, and we'll come back to more questions on this. Before I request the next presenter, I would just like to request the audience to put in their questions in the Q&A box on different platforms. So thanks, Professor Thomas, and may I please request Dr. Arun Dundas to make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Surbhi. In this presentation today, what I'll be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on employment and wages in rural India using pandemic study data unit of Foundation for Agrarian Studies, that conducted during the month of September and October. Along with these data sets, I will be using wage rates in rural India data of Labor Bureau to see the changes in wage rates for last 6-7 months. Last 6-7 months. So before I present my results, I would like to highlight some features of rural labor market, particularly to casual labor market, and also the impact of COVID-19 on employment and wages studied by the rural labor market, studied by other scholars. So according to the periodical labor force survey of 2018-19, approximately 25% of the rural household were classified as a rural labor household. As per village studies by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, between 40 to 60% of the households were classified manual worker household, as they derive their 90% of the income from manual work or casual work. So the labor market is characterized by high dependence on the informal sector, with construction and agriculture acting as a major sources of employment. We have witnessed in the last 1.5 decades a increasing in unemployment and severe underemployment among the rural wage workers. Our data also shows the large section of the rural wage workers received less than 6 months of employment in a year. So thus, with this given characteristics of the labor market, the COVID-19 and resultant immediate lockdown have strongly impacted employment wages and wages of the rural casual workers. So what is the impact of lockdown on rural labor market? There are study by different scholars and institutions. I would like to highlight few studies. These are the very important studies. One studies by the Azim Premji University between April and May showed that roughly 56% of the rural workforce lost their employment opportunities during the lockdown. According to CMI data, unemployment rate increased roughly about 20% during the lockdown period. Women, migrant casual workers, scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in rural India were more vulnerable during the lockdown period, and many of them lost their job during the period. We realized, and we studied, Foundation for Agrarian Studies conducted also a telephonic survey of 52 informants from 21 villages across 10 states in India in the month of April. The results are published in Review of Agrarian Studies by Tapus Singh Modak, Shandipan Bokshi, and Deepak Johnson. I will highlight few results from their study. It shows that a complete collapse of rural and periodical sources of income, and that had severely hit the rural wage workers. during the pandemic time, there is a complete collapse of rural uh, non-farm employment, including employment under MGNRJ. The collapse was due to restriction of the movement of the worker and non-availability of the employment. So it is severely impacted on the wage workers. Do we see any recovery in relation to employment and decent earnings after lockdown? Again, there is one study by Azim Premji University between September and October of 2788 respondents across 12 states found that 55% of the workers recover from job losses suffered during the lockdown, while 15% registered no recovery at all. Similar, using CMI data, Rosa and her colleague also concluded similar sort of point. Now, what I'll be highlighting, I'll be highlighting the major findings from our FAS PSU telephonic survey, PSU pandemic studies telephonic survey on employment and wages. So FAS established a pandemic study unit to study the impact of pandemic on agricultural production, rural wages and employment, agricultural work in rural India, food security and consumption, and credit. Tapas, Soham, Niyati, they have presented agricultural production, food security and consumption. That is there in our YouTube channel. What today I'll be highlighting the rural employment and wages. So we have conducted this study in the month of September, October 2020 in 26 villages across 13 states. This draws on a detailed socioeconomic survey of 24 villages were conducted by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies under the India-wide program of village studies titled Project on Agrarian Relations in India during last 1.5 decades. Two villages that we have studied in Kerala was surveyed by our colleague Deepak Johnson for his research work in 1819, and we have studied for our pandemic study, impact of the pandemic study. We have collected 164 informant, of which among this across 164 informant, we have landlord classes, rich peasants, poor peasants, medium peasants, manual worker households, and others also. So these are the village that we have studied for the pandemic study units. It represents the varied agroecological zones with irrigated and unirrigated and dry villages. Some of the villages, for example, and also it covers different kind of agricultural and non-agricultural activities. For example, Anandavaram, paddy cultivation village. Katkuya, we have this special feature where rural to rural migration happen, like from migrant worker, the workers migrate during the paddy transplantation time in one of our study villages, that is Tehan. So we can easily track what is happening with the workers and their employment and wages. So the question that we have asked, the impact of COVID-19 on employment and wages, that is basically we have collected data on number of days of employment of each worker who perform any wage work in crop production and non-agricultural occupation, including Manrega, during and after lockdown. So roughly our reference period is March to October, September, October. The information pertaining to wage rates on daily rated and piece rated were also collected for the both period. And for the comparability purpose, we have also collected wage rates. It's a recall wage rates of Kharif 2019. So to check, to see the changes in wage rates. The first result that I want to highlight here, the recovery of employment among the casual worker households. So what is very striking that there is a recovery of employment. So it is more for the female compared to male workers. So in other words, female were more vulnerable during the lockdown period than the male workers. Second point that I would like to highlight here, that many studies like data which is available, that is CMI data, they have collected weekly status, daily status, or if anybody received any wage work during that time period. What we have collected, that is uniqueness of our data, and we have been collecting, is days of employment. Okay, so we have collected days of employment by occupation, operation, in agriculture, non-agriculture, by gender, by operations. So if we look at this table, distribution of workers, size class, workers by size class of number of days of employment. I have calculated, we have a data pre-lockdown and post-lockdown, but to see the changes, we have calculated here from June to October, and we clearly shows there is a severe underemployment among the manual workers households. It is higher for the male workers than the female workers. Like 30 days of employment received by approximately 50%, less than 50% of the female workers during this period, whereas male more than 50% of the workers. So we see a severe underemployment in this period. So these days of employment we have calculated for all the sectors, the total days of employment received by any workers. But there are few exceptions. One is that there are villages that what we have seen that like Varvat Khanderao or in Palakuchi, the few workers received 60 to 140 days of employment during this period. So this is because of the increasing agriculture participation in agricultural activities, basically employment received in agricultural sectors, and MG Energy played a very important role. But what we have seen across all villages, the non-agricultural sector completely collapsed. That is why the male received very low days of employment than the female. Second aspects that I would highlight here, that female and male both participated in agricultural sectors. This is a time for transplantation. Female participation is significantly high, but what we have observed in the data, because there is a surplus level in the villages, return migrants, male might be replaced to female workers. So female, that is why the participation of both very, very high. Now what I have done, we have discussed here, I will discuss that employment received by each sector, agriculture, non-agriculture, and MG energy. Agriculture played a very important role to create employment in the villages. But there are variations. We found three distinct features that emerged across the villages. First, villages with cultivated depends on workers from outside village. Days of employment in agriculture for the workers within the village was relatively high. So villages which require workers or depends on the workers from the outside village, we see because there is no movement of the workers, the restriction of the movement of the workers, inside the village workers receive relatively high days of employment. One case studies that I have mentioned here is basically Bukacharla of Andhra Pradesh village. What one respondent told us that he generally employ workers from Bellary of Karnataka district of Karnataka on a piece rated basis for harvesting banana. Due to lockdown, he had to hire local workers from the villages on a daily rated basis to complete the harvest. Same narrative told by the other farmers that who cultivated orange on 5 acres of land also faced a similar kind of problem, and he had to hire local workers. So that is why the days of employment was relatively high for the few villages. For example, Punjab, for the paddy transplantation time, they depends on the migrant workers from UP and Bihar. Because there is a scarcity of labor, they had to hire either within the village or the nearby villages. So this is one feature. Second feature that we have observed, with a large scale of return migrant and surplus labor, average days employed per worker in agriculture was low. Example is, we have taken from there are examples available, Nayanagar, Katkuya in Bihar, West Bengal also we have seen similar kind of a problem, and also Anantapuram. So I'll give one case studies for Anantapuram. So days of employment declined significantly, one landless laborer reported, and the agricultural work is a seasonal work, particularly during harvesting and transplanting time. They get much of employment in agriculture. Every year they travel to the neighboring districts during the transplanting season on a piece rated work. That was also not possible this year because of travel restriction. Thus, they have lost their jobs. So they have received 45 days of employment, whereas they got 60 to 70 days of employment in the last year. Third feature of agriculture is that villages where predominance of small farmer, they are using either family labor or exchange level. So one case studies that I've given here is Muhuripur of Tripura. Now I'll move to the employment under MG and REGA. What we have observed are previous data and this data also, like the data which we have collected during month of April and May, and this PSU data, the employment under MG and REGA was completely collapsed. So whatever the government increased their budget, they increased their wage rates, nothing has happened, significantly impacted the rural workers because the work under MG and REGA completely collapsed. During the lockdown period, post-lockdown period, there is an increase in days of employment in few city villages. So there is a marginal revival also in the MG energy. None of the in villages like Amorshinge, Kalmandajguri of West Bengal, Katkuya, Nayanagar of Bihar and Punjab, none of the household received employment under MG energy. In response to our question, one respondent from Kalmandajguri village of West Bengal informed us that he applied for a job in Panchayat office but did not receive any work under MG energy. The employment was provided to the local ruling party workers during and after the lockdown. But there are exceptions also. In two villages in Tamil Nadu, that is Venmani and Palakurchi of Nagapattinam district, the performance was exceptionally well in terms of implementation of MGMDJ. In our 4 households that we surveyed, received more 100 days of employment under MG and REGA. Third, which is very important, because already Jayan mentioned that workers had to depend on because there is a decline in non-agricultural employment, so workers had to depend on the non-agricultural employment, on construction sectors, on any other emerging sources of non-agricultural employment. What we have observed, there is a complete collapse during the lockdown period. For example, quarry work in Zapur villages, bricklayer work in Katkuya, Hakambala, but very slow recovery because due to travel restriction and collapse nearby urban towns or urban centers. So one bus conductor who was employed on a daily basis from Katkuya of Bihar villages reported that during the lockdown, he did not get a single day of employment. After the lockdown, he received 5 to 6 days of employment work till August, and from September, he's getting 15 to 20 days. So the employment in agriculture is increasing in some villages. MG is slowly recovering, but in case of non-farm employment where male workers are largely dependent, are collapsed or not functioning at all, are very slow recovery. Palakurchi village is one example that I have given here. Overall, what we have seen that there is a recovery, but to what extent? The days of employment is very low for the casual worker households. It depends, it varied across the villages, depend on the activities that is available in the villages. Now I will turn to the rural wage rate. For this part, I have used our data and the wage rates in rural India data of Labour Bureau. WRI gives wage rates on a daily rated basis. So they do not collect or not collect the piece rated wage rates. What we have seen in the last 1.5 decades, the wage rates between 2006-7 to 2012-13 increased at the rate of 8%, but 13 onwards, roughly 14-15 to 2018-19, wage rate for the most of the occupation, agriculture, non-agriculture, male, female, stagnant. It is stagnated at the rate, growth rate was 1% per annum for male. Female was also 2% and 3%. So high growth period. Now it is real wage rates in the rural areas stagnated. What we have seen after during the lockdown period. This is also from the Labour Bureau data. What we have seen that wage rates in the rural area completely collapsed. Daily wage rates. It is not collapsed during the COVID time period. It has collapsed before the COVID. Basically, after it collapsed during August, September, or July, August in 2019. So there is a collapse in rural wage rates. It's not during the COVID time. It has collapsed much before, but Last 4 or 5 years, what we have observed, there is a decline or stagnant in wage rate. It can be easily visible because of the GST implementation or demonetization, but it is worsened during the lockdown period. Slight recovery we have observed in the month of August and September, or July and August, because of transplanting operations, or slight revival, but again declining. In case of female workers, similar observation we have found. So what is the story? Story is this, that rural wage rate is declining. So the important part is that money wage rate remained the same during this period. It increased 6 rupees for the male worker and 3 rupees for the female workers. That means one point I should mention here, that every year, like before the or of new agricultural year, the wage revision happened in the villages. So in the bargaining way or some other way, but this year we do not see such revisions in wage rates. So that is why the nominal wage remain the same, but real wage decline sharply, about 3.8% in the month of March and 4.7% in the month of for the female workers. It declined badly. Similar thing for in the construction sector. The slight improvement in the month of July, but again declining. There's a statewide variation. The surplus migrant workers states like Bihar, where the migrant workers goes to the Delhi and others, Kerala, there they have this wage decline sharply, like its growth rate was negative 4 to 8%. Southern Indian states also recorded negative growth rate. Now, what is our data showing? Important here is that almost all the villages, what we have observed, compared to previous Kharif, the wage rate declined. The real wage rates declined. Nominal wage rate, most of the villages remain the same, except Katkuya, where the nominal wage rates also declined sharply for the male workers. But 2 or 3 villages, Arindam, Bukachalla and Nimshergaon, the wage rates marginally increase due to the worker crisis that I have mentioned here. This crisis or the migrant, they depends on the migrant workers. But the state where the wage declined, for example, in Katkuya, Bihar, because of the surplus labor. Now, changes in piece rated wage rates. Now, most of the villages, most of the operation, you see there's a increasing proliferation of the piece rated wage rates. What we have seen, that in case of piece rated wages also, there's a decline. In nominal wages, it was almost same, but in real term, it's declined. But except Punjab and Hakamwala, what I have checked with the WRI data, it is showing that there's a negative growth during this period. Why there's a contradiction? Basically, they collect daily rated wages, don't focus much on the piece rated wages. We collected both the wages, and most of the operation in the Punjab and Haryana is done by the piece rated workers. So because of this migrant worker crisis, there is an increase in wages for the piece rated operation. So this is the story is coming out. This question of wage methodology, with how they are collecting data, method, this we have recently discussed in the review. We have published one paper, review of Agrarian Studies, where we have discussed in detail methodology wage collection, where we have what we have discussed, reported there, that it's a reporting problem. There's a lot of methodological issues in the official data sources. That is why the growth rate or the changes in wage rates are much lower than what our data is showing. So overall, what I want to conclude is that there is a recovery of employment, as shown by other studies also, but to what extent days of employment is very, very low. So there is underemployment. The wage rates for the rural workers are declining. So overall, this is the story that I like to highlight. Thank you. Thank you, Surbhi.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Das. That was a very insightful presentation. I guess in a lot of work that I've been seeing coming out, the kind of work that you and others have been doing at FAS with agriculture sector just gives us so much understanding of what's happening in the agri market, which often gets left out in the broad, kind of labor market stories that we talk about. So this is very interesting. Just wanted to flag a couple of things taking off from what you said. It's interesting how the nature of impact is very gendered, and it's different across various social lines and across these different fragments, which also, while we are designing a policy response or thinking about designing a policy response, needs to be kept in mind. For example, we're finding that in overall the employment loss is much higher for women, and the recovery is much, much slower for them. In an economy which already has such low female labor force participation, this is a big red flag. And those are kind of things that we need to address and make central to while we are talking about policy changes. So thanks for bringing up, those issues. And also, interestingly, what another, works that are being done by Rahul Lahoti and Mrinalini Jha and others at the center, we're actually finding that the proportion of income loss was in fact relatively higher for those who had lower pre-pandemic income. So it's basically a rising inequality, something that I, along with Rahul Lahoti, also talk about in in one of the pieces. And that is something that's the mammoth amount of thing. All existing vulnerabilities and fragmentations have become even more widened over this pandemic, and that is something that I think is is a really big red flag for us to think about how to go forward from here. So thanks a lot, Dr. Das. I would like to request our final panelist, Dr. Shamsher Singh, to please make his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Surbhi, for your introduction and for giving me the opportunity. I would also like to thank Pandemic Studies Unit of the Foundation for Agrarian Studies for inviting me and to allow me to share my views on something which we all have been discussing in last few months. Just a disclaimer to the audience and to the panelists that I don't really strictly fit into the the framework or the definition of labor scholars like other panelists here. So whatever I say today is basically informed and from my experience of my participation in the relief work which I was part of in the city of Pune in the months after the lockdown among the interstate migrant workers, to help them with various requirements. The campaign, the relief work was coordinated and conducted and carried out by trade union activists and activists of mass organizations of youth and women, Pune Jila Kamgar Sanghthana, etc. And my involvement in that campaign kind of informed me in various aspects of this crisis. And I am grateful to the organizations and individuals who gave me that opportunity as well. My colleague Kiran Moge, who basically was the central of all these operations. Other colleagues at with youth organizations and women organizations, etc. Also part of this. So basically, my job is much easier given that this audience is already informed by the earlier presentations from the panelists about the character of the migrant workforce and its major facets. So I would just quickly, at the sound of sounding little repetitive, take you through what had unfolded after the nationwide lockdown, which was announced at a very short notice on the March of 25th evening. So we all are aware of the role played by the migrant workers in their economic contribution and their involvement in the Indian economy, and what role do they play. This basically, left them the sudden announcement of the lockdown in the last week of March left them really in a very difficult situation when their sources of livelihood, etc., came to a sudden halt within a few hours of notice. And given the size of the migrant workforce we have, according to some estimates, which is more than almost around 480 million, the crisis was humongous, and you can understand the kind of anxieties these people had to go through. And this is also especially the the most vulnerable sections of this already disadvantaged workforce were the interstate migrant workers, who usually do not have much of, say, network support or the kinship ties, or various other kind of official documents and support, which makes them further vulnerable than their counterparts who still migrate within the jurisdictions of their own states or the home state. So basically, these workers, interstate migrant workers and interstate migrant workers, usually hail from relatively poor regions and relatively backward locations of rural India or small towns, to the cities and urban agglomerations, usually are employed informally and as work as casual implies. Most of the workers which we found in our survey in Pune, which was carried out preceding the relief work which was conducted here, most of them, a majority of them, were employed in construction sector, infrastructure development activities. Some section of this workforce was also employed in manufacturing units, hotel and restaurants, kind of service sector, housekeeping, security guard, and delivery services. Given the employment arrangement these workers work under, they are not entitled to, as pointed out by other panelists also, any kind of social security provisions such as minimum wages, timely payment of wages, provident fund, and other kind of pensions and incentives by their employers. In fact, some of the workers which whom we interacted did not even know their employer. They were subcontracted, then further subcontracted to maybe the second or third level of contractors, and they had no idea who was the primary hiring agencies. In some cases, these workers had no idea whom to contact in the times of crisis. So this was the nature of the contracts which these people seem to be suggesting that they had some kind of contract. Now the lockdown and the migrant workers, of course, this crisis and the kind of vulnerable situations and the dismal working conditions in which they work, and also the dismal conditions in which they live, was brought out by various studies, and it was also highlighted by media reports. And they in a way, when their only source of livelihood and earnings came to a standstill, and the activities in which they were participating were stopped overnight, whatever little savings they had or whatever borrowings they could manage also ran dry in a couple of days. And then most of them had no other way but to either go hungry or rely on some handouts and some relief material handed over to them by civil society organizations and various individuals who were trying to help these migrant workers in their individual capacity. So the first thing is that the higher vulnerability, and they're relying on the contractors which had switched off their phones, which were unable to be contacted by the workers, was such a critical angle or the critical aspect of the kind of conditions in which they were employed and they were working. Secondly, the highly inadequate and insufficient intervention by the local administration, where given the situation in which these workers did not have any local proof of residence, or because they were all put into small rooms, 7-8 workers were in small temporary arrangements were made for their accommodation, etc. They had nowhere to go when the workers, when the contractors, etc., or employees stopped receiving their phones, and the landlords asked them to vacate the accommodation in which they were living. So all these aspects were also highlighted by a number of independent studies by Swan, colleagues at the Azim Premji University, ActionAid, and other individual scholars. Now, these workers were also like in these extreme circumstances, were going hungry. They were being asked to vacate their accommodation, and there was of course an increasing risk and threat of getting infected if they step out. They faced extreme hostilities from the local authorities, and also in some cases from the local people, where they were like there were several cases which were reported by the media when these people entered the a state then in which they were working. They were like in Bareilly or in somewhere else. They were sprayed with with pesticides by the local administration. They were thrashed in multiple locations by the police. They were lathi charged, etc. So given that entire absence of adequate measures and interventions by the administrations, which led to their mass exodus from their place of work to their home states. Workers started heading on the roads. They hit the road by whatever was possible, either by booking very expensive private vehicles, in autos, in lorries, in containers, in cement and concrete mixers, etc. Some also, of course, on foot, and a couple of hundreds of them also died because of accidents, suicides, and exertion. So this is the situation which unfolded in the coming, in the following weeks of the nationwide lockdown. Now, as some other scholars have also pointed out, that the interstate and the seasonal and circular migrant workers were the worst hit by the lockdown, given that, as I mentioned, that they had no local support or any kinship or other networks of support mechanism available with them. They in most cases they had no residential proof or no residential proof or any other kind of local documents which can enable them to approach the administration for some help or support. So and major exclusion which took place because of the absence of these very documents was their absence from public distribution system and other cash transfers which were enabled by the state governments or the central government also. So these conditions make their exclusion in the urban area multidimensional. The lack of social and welfare support makes them rely heavily on the local contractors more so in times of distress like this one. So they had to borrow money from their employers. In fact, we came across cases where they approached a competitor or a rival contractor, and the rival contractor, of course, looking for the workers in whatever was opening up, activities were opening up, and they, in some of the cases, they had to in a way agree to the conditions put by the contractor, that they will work for them once they start things start becoming normal, and at lower wages, and whichever task they will assign to. So these were the cases which makes them their entire situation even more critical. Now, something which was assigned as a part of the policy brief for migrant workers in the post COVID-19 under the pandemic studies unit is that there are, of course, various kinds of interventions, as also highlighted by Professor Jayan and other scholars also in their work, which can be put in place to help and support the recovery of the economy, and also once the migrant workers start coming back, if they do, to their earlier work locations or alternative work locations, to in a way help them to have a maybe relatively better situation. So there are various kinds of interventions which can be, which one can highlight, given the multidimensionality of the exclusion and the deprivation they go through. But in this note for the pandemic studies unit, I have tried to, talked about two, specific programs which, some of us think, can be, can be suggested for, for a post-COVID-19 era to, in a way, intervene for the migrant workers. So first of, such schemes which we propose is the Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, which, multiple and a number of development economists and activists have spoken about recently. And they have, the very reason that, now we have a higher, unemployment, there is a, also the recovery is taking, longer than what was expected. A lot of people have still not gotten, back to their work, or maybe in more exploitative conditions, as Professor Surbhi pointed out, that it is, increasingly, becoming more informal in the phase of recovery. So to in a way counter these high levels of unemployment, and to make sure that there is a minimum livelihood security and the guaranteed employment, we propose that for not only for migrant workers but also for the the poorest of the poor in the urban areas. There is a requirement of a demand and right, demand driven and a rights based public urban employment guarantee scheme, a scheme which can be worked out based on the similar ideas of its counterpart in the rural areas, which is known by Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, or Act. So something like this can be thought about, to be put in place in the urban areas, to not only help the migrant workers but also the other poor sections of the urban poor. This also in a way suggest this also could be utilized to the migrant workers who do not come individual, or who do not come alone in the city, but they also are accompanied usually by either their relatives or by their family members or their spouse. Sometimes who do not get work, or a dignified work, or work which they would like to work on. So some of these participants also can in a way use this opportunity where they have at least some guaranteed source of employment, rather than agreeing to very exploitative work conditions under various kind of contract works. Something like this is in a way scheme which almost now almost a decade, which is in place in the state of Kerala, known as the Ayan Urban Employment Guarantee Scheme, and it makes a provision of 100 days of employment in a year for a household, and especially for for the adult members of the household residing under the urban administrative bodies. However, I mean, there have been a couple of reports which have pointed out certain issues with the implementation and the design of the scheme, that it usually the work is not assigned on time. There is not much of a wage incentives, or so certain issues of its implementation and effectiveness still remain to be improved. But nevertheless, this kind of scheme can be worked out at an all India level for urban urban workforce. The urban employment guarantee scheme then should be designed to specific urban conditions, nature and requirements of the work, which can be brought under its ambit, given that the urban landscape is quite different than the rural areas. This needs to be also in a more innovative way put in place, that what kind of potential improvements can be made. It could be used to enhance skill training, or kind of apprenticeship, or gain full self-employment for the urban youth by incentivizing them to participate in certain activities, etc., or to build basic common or public infrastructure in urban area. So there's a requirement of it being, more innovatively implemented and designed given the requirements of certain urban contexts. The second scheme, which is not something which we propose, but which already has been announced by the central government, but yet to be implemented. So the second one, from this is the scheme called One Nation, One Ration Card, ONORC. So as I mentioned in the earlier slides, the disastrous consequences of exclusion of migrant workers from the subsidized food, which in a way was very critical in the times when they were going hungry, or they had to rely severely, restrict their eating and their dietary intake, like through the work which we were carrying out in the city of Pune. We came across when the workers from Muslim community, there was a they were on rosa. So that was the phase in which they had to rely only on boiled rice and with some salt. There was no other way for them to have any that was the meal which they were having once a day. So these kind of exclusion of the interstate migrant workers, especially from the food grain entitlements, is something which which is very central to their well-being, and it is very critical to to confront this kind of exclusion. So the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme is from that perspective is a very important intervention, and it is something which aims to deliver food security entitlements to all the beneficiaries who are currently covered under the National Food Security Act of 2013. And the basic mandate behind this scheme is that irrespective of the physical location of the beneficiary, they can access their entitlement of food grain from any part of the country. So this scheme, as I mentioned, was launched in June 2019. The scheme is aimed at bringing interstate portability of ration to all PDS beneficiaries, making it easier for migrant workers to access their ration entitlements in the place of their residence. So just a few months back, what the latest update was on this was that 28 states and union territories had already in a way made some sort of transition, or had made some sort of arrangements for national portability of ration cards. In the current budget, in the budget, it was mentioned that now the number of states and union territory has increased to 32. So there are still some states which need to come on board to make it a nationwide implementation of this scheme. This was expected to be launched or implemented by March 2021, but it seems that it is going to take even longer, because given the progress on this front from the latest available reports, it seems that some of the states are going to take longer times due to the technical difficulties. Now there are certain concerns about the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme. Of course, the first of such ration scheme is that there already exists a large-scale exclusion and under coverage of the legally entitled food beneficiaries and ration card holders, as pointed out by Ritika Khera and other scholars, that the government estimates are they are underestimates of the population which is supposed to be covered by the National Food Security Act of 2013. So the net, there's a large-scale exclusion of food beneficiaries under the already existing scheme and entitlements. So the One Nation, One Ration Card scheme must address this exclusion. And in fact, the initial experiences from certain states raise certain serious questions about the operational aspects. Some of the things which have been pointed out by the activists from various states is that there is no clear cut or proper instructions how this kind of how their how the central or the one centralized scheme of disbursing ration is going to take into consideration the various kinds of items in the ration basket. How are they going to make a consistent kind of transfer of certain ration items in the ration basket, which are dispersed by different states? For example, in northern India, maybe the requirement of the wheat or the disbursement of wheat is higher than the rice eating regions of the country. Again, there's an issue of inconsistency between pricing. Certain states put higher subsidies into the ration which is dispersed to the beneficiaries or their state residents. So these kind of issues are also going to be resolved if it needs to be really effectively implemented. The third and the major concern regarding this scheme, and which can lead to a really severe and severe exclusion, is the mandatory condition of seeding Aadhaar card with beneficiaries Radhan card. And the government has really been highlighting this as a major reform. That all the to eliminate bogus and illegitimate beneficiaries, etc., which is not really a significant issue, as pointed out by the scholars in the current system also. So the insistence of seeding Aadhaar cards with beneficiary ration cards and more centralized which is called the integrated management of public distribution system, which will be biometric enabled, etc., is going to lead to severe exclusion of people, those who may not have Aadhaar card or who may not be able to activate their biometrics, or may not be able to seed their Aadhaar cards with their ration cards. So this kind of increased and more emphasized and very aggressively pushed technocratization and IT based implementation, or the IT solutions to the central to this kind of implementation of schemes are needs to be looked into by the authorities and by the government to and this is actually like a time where the long standing demand of various academic and activists to make the public distribution system universal, and to eliminate and to do away with any kind of exclusion in accessing public distribution system on subsidized rates, bringing in higher maybe higher number of food items or the ration items into the ambit of public distribution system, making sure that there is an easy access by the migrant, by the workers households, individual or collectively, in the sites of their employment. So usually if they are situated far away places, these people usually are not very encouraged to access those public distribution system shops. So there needs to be expand, make it universal, and also to make it accessible to these sections of the population in the post COVID phase. And this is something which needs to be looked into if we think of a more inclusive and a dignified treatment to our workforce. Thank you. This is it from my side.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. It was a very interesting presentation. And especially, it kind of reminds me of a couple of things of how when the entire migrant workers were, the 4 hours notice that you talked about, along with an economic crisis, we were also in the middle of a humanitarian crisis. And it just shows the disposability of workers in the cities. You have the cities which stand out as representation of the work, whereas the workers who are constructing it are constantly being invisibilized. And it's amazing how this huge proportion of workforce just ceased to exist in the imagination of the policymakers. And I think to that extent, this is in fact a really interesting point that you made. Second, to just go back to your point on the urban employment guarantee, it's an interesting one and something that's been gaining more traction by the day as most researchers are getting engaged in this project. it also kind of centers the need for a rights-based discourse when we are talking about any sort of employment measure, or we're talking about just generally food insecurity in the country. We're not simply talking about, despite the pandemic and despite where we are, about doles and charities and philanthropy. This is a right of a worker, this is a right of a citizen to be having access to work and livelihood in a dignified way of getting that livelihood. And I think that's completely on point and a central part of where we want to push the narrative today. So thank you very much for making those interventions. I will go to the questions. We have some questions from the audience. I would also request others to put in the questions as well, and if fellow panelists want to put some questions to others. So I'm going to start with a bunch of questions that we already have, and maybe I'll start with a couple of questions to Professor Jayan Thomas, where Suranjana Kundu asks you, do you think persistent low interest rate by central bank and recent food price inflation has damaged the life of informal job holders or laborers who lost during the pandemic in a greater magnitude than creating job through the credit channel, since the policy transmission rate is already very low in India? There's another question for you where by Dr. Matthew Kurian, who's asking, how would you view the emphasis on infrastructure investment in the last union budget in the creation of jobs? So just to kind of add to it, I would also request if you could say a little more about to what extent, the issues that collectively the research community has been raising have been addressed in the current budget, and to what extent does it fall short? So thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you, Surbhi, for collecting them. I would perhaps, I think my main point was that what we need the way forward is clearly at this moment public investment, and not just assistance through the credit channel mechanism. What we require is public investment. And public investment, like we said, the multiplier effects are huge, given the crisis that we are in, given the employment crisis that we have been facing, not just the COVID-induced crisis, but a crisis that we have been facing for more than 3 decades. And in fact, we showed how the employment situation is getting worse, the mismatch between the supply of potential workers in the non-agricultural sectors and the actual demand for these workers is deepening, after 2012. So given that, so we can actually think of areas where investment can be done on a priority basis. Think of education, think of health. And we already started by saying that, in the latest period, after 2012, the sectors which generated employment and employment for women in big numbers were health and education. And clearly these are sectors where, no one can question this. No one can question how useful these sectors are for the general economy, but also as a measure for employment creation for women. We have seen the papers, Niyati, Nelson, about ASHA workers, how they have been very poorly paid, how their duties have increased in the post-COVID because they have been heroically fighting the situation in the post-COVID scenario. So clearly that is one, education, health. And another would be rural infrastructure, where again where the multiplier effects are huge. Roads, agro-processing. We mentioned agro-processing because ultimately we are interested in the transition away from agriculture, more value addition within rural areas. In fact, instead of workers coming to the cities, if we can think of a development where more employment and development is more dispersed. In fact, the way development happened in many of the East Asian countries, China, for instance, during the 1980s. So again, there are cold storage or transportation facilities, agro processing facilities. So I think these are the areas where investment can be made, and much of it can come from the public sector, at least to begin with. I mean, one is not saying that the private sector do not have a role, but clearly in many remote areas in the country, a beginning can be made with the public sector, and that can change the situation. I've not looked at the budget numbers in detail, so I cannot really comment on it. But my understanding, from my broad understanding, is that given the challenge that is in, and given the opportunity that we have, the current budget may not have done enough when it comes to public investment. I think I will end with that comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just add one more question along with this before I move on to the next panelist, which is by Professor Swaminathan, who's asking that while she agrees with the need for massive expansion of wage employment, but how do we ensure better skilled employment rather than just drudgerous manual jobs through Narega type programs? So this is a question for both you and for, I guess, Dr. Singh can also comment on that after.
I can, may I quickly answer this? I believe here, while, we know, I mean, we are a labor surplus country. I mean, our task is to create more employment, but that doesn't in any way, I mean, we also have, in a country like ours, there's a big role for technology. And I think that is what I would emphasize here. Technology, I mean, typically our understanding of technology is that technology displaces labor, and therefore technology is not the way forward. But in many areas, technology can actually create employment. I was just, I mean, in Kerala, for instance, we have, as part of the work for the planning board, I remember taking part in a meeting on the coir sector. It's a traditional industry which typically employed a very large number of workforce in the state. But coir also is as a material. It has certain properties, its strength. It has applications in several sectors, and a lot of research is happening. In fact, so the conference that we organized, we invited experts in various areas who do advanced research in biotechnology, nanotechnology, material research, and looked at ways in which a material like coir can be used, can have new applications, which can actually create new employment. So I guess that is the way forward. We have to use technology. Clearly, there's no question of training, imparting skills, polytechnics, industrial training institutes, and not just engineering colleges. There has been an expansion of engineering colleges, but we also need skill training institutes in the country, across the country. Yes, I would agree with the comment expressed by Professor Swaminathan. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Thomas. If I may request Dr. Singh to come in here as a response to this question, as well as, so we have a similar question by Dr. Judith here as well, who's asking, it was good to hear the play on employment-led growth, but what do you think about encouraging higher quality of employment, part of which, Professor Thomas just addressed. But another question to you, Dr. Singh, is ration cards are usually issued on a household basis. Does the ONORC have to be on individual basis? Many migrants might, in fact, migrate individually. Another question by Judith here.
Actually, yeah, I don't have much to add to the question on employment or the nature of, like, I broadly, of course, like agree with Professor Jayan on the advancement of and the use of more technology based and the more strategic advancement of the employment conditions in the economy. And also, like something just to add to that, one additional point is that it's, I mean, the right-based, minimum employment guarantee schemes are not these are like, also from very immediate and a short-term, maybe kind of, once the, the workforce always itself moves into a more advanced and more sustainable kind of, employment opportunities, the demand-driven, the basic security related employment schemes also, of course, like wither away if you have more sustained kind of employment opportunities in your economy. So these measures are often immediate or immediate nature, which can ensure a basic sustainable work and livelihood options in different areas. So this is, thanks Judith actually for pointing out the ration card point which I forgot to mention. And you're right that the ration cards are allotted at the issued at the household level. So the thing is in this that the allotments are on individual basis, on the basis of number of household members per household. So the household gets allotment of certain kind of of the volume of the entitlement based on the number of adults and children in the family. So this has been also an issue which has been raised by different people regarding its implementation, that once there is a division in the household. So for example, maybe one of the members come to city. So how is that going to be feasible for them to access their quota, which is going to be also like really, really small in a different location, and the rest of the household will be accessing in a different location. So this of course leads to an issue related to implementation in addition to what I already mentioned. But the allotments are usually on the count of the number of household members in the family. So there is a provision that they will be, actually that is something which was also highlighted by the finance minister in the recently presented finance speech, that the individual members will be able to access their entitlement in a different location. But it of course does not lead to a substantial amount in case you have individual withdrawing their quota other than the rest of the family.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Singh. I'll probably come to Dr. Das right now and ask one question just for my own clarity. So, when we were conducting the survey during the lockdown, and we found a lot of people actually said that they could either not sell their produce or were not able to harvest their produce during the lockdown because, there was a lockdown. You couldn't really go out and work. And now we are past that phase, and we're talking about the wage, what's happened to, wage employment and the wage rates, etc. But I also wonder, was there any significant impact per se in terms of harvest and the ability of people, let's say, who were even farmers who were owning land, etc., to be able to sell or harvest their produce? Was there a significant impact there as well?
Yeah, so in our survey, what we have found, many farmers, like especially wheat harvest, is significantly affected. They have sold their production much lower than the MSP, much lower than the MSP. So the price crash for the production. We are yet to, because just paddy harvesting is over, so we do not know about the paddy. But yes, wheat has severely impacted by the price.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you for clarifying that. So we have a couple more questions. One, I think I'll come back to Professor Thomas with this one, where there's a question by Aravindan who is asking, would a focus on analyzing infrastructural constraint within the unorganized sector enterprises be more helpful, given the public sector investment is not forthcoming? The unorganized sector faces constraints of scale in the absence of credit and subsidy. So, I guess probably about the scaling up of the enterprises, which has been kind of an important thing. And in the mix, I'll also just throw one question, which is a provocative one and not necessarily something that I would subscribe to. But, we're talking about this huge surplus population all across the world. India, yes, huge informality, Latin America, Africa, fine. But, and high unemployment levels, let's say in South Africa, etc. But globally, we're also talking about a rise of informality in the formally developed economies, which are supposed to be kind of the goalpost of what we're trying to achieve. Is this a right time to very critically and almost radically think about the, sort of limits to employment and whether employment and work still needs to be the center of the economy? So just a provocative thing in the mix of those questions.
Thank you, Surbhi. Thank you, Arvind, for the question. On the first question, yes, the unorganized sector in India. I've done some work on the manufacturing part of the unorganized sector. There are several issues, as was mentioned. So it's several infrastructural issues. I just gave one piece of information about the credit, how credit received by small and micro enterprises have come down over time. But there are bigger issues, such as, for instance, the linkage between the bigger enterprises and the smaller enterprises. If you go to, say, Coimbatore, if you go to Surat, many of these places had an ecosystem where typically the enterprises and the small enterprises, they had some kind of an interaction. Typically, many of these small enterprises used to be suppliers of some kind of a part to the bigger enterprises. But over time, what has been happening, growth is led increasingly by big corporates or foreign MNCs. And I've heard this from several entrepreneurs, industrial entrepreneurs, that MNCs do not actually want to work with the unorganized sector, with the small industries. Also, increasing imported components. So all that is causing issues. So yes, we really need to think about enabling the unorganized sector. Of course, I mean, nobody wants the unorganized sector to remain unorganized and to remain, technologically quite backward. We really need them to go forward. But the interesting thing about the unorganized sector, it's not that they use less advanced technologies. That's something which really have to change. They have to use better technologies. They have to use skilled labor. They have to have entrepreneurs who are highly professionally qualified. The interesting thing, and that's the thing which we want to retain about the unorganized sector, is that this is a sector which creates employment. This is a sector where entrepreneurship, which provide huge opportunities for entrepreneurship. So it's a sector which is not dominated by a few big players. So that, there's a democratic feature of the unorganized sector. That's something which we want to retain. At the same time, it has to be modernized. And whatever is needed, and a huge amount of the help required to modernize the unorganized sector can come from public investment. It can also come from central banks, from a more liberal credit policy, from the institutional banking system. I think these have to come, and it's extremely urgent steps needed to revive the Indian economy. Given that, I mean, our 50% of our workforce, more than 200 plus million people are entrepreneurs. They are self-employed. They know how to, they use their inventiveness, innovation to kind of, seek their livelihood. So that's something which we really need to think. Thank you for that question, Surbhi. Yes, this is the right time to think about probably a new model. And probably this is, I mean, if what happened after 1950, after the Second World War, we had this golden age of capitalism. It's partly because the economic profession, the policymakers, we were all ready to think on a new line. Perhaps the crisis that we are facing now should generate such a discussion among policymakers, among economists. Yes, I mean, look at most of the world. We are facing a slowing down of the population. So demand is crucial. Everybody knows that. So to revive demand, you can't continue with a policy where there is greater informalization. There is stagnancy in wages. We actually need a very different model. In fact, the opposite of that. We need a model. Demand is the crucial thing. So we need a development model in which wages rise, workers' conditions rise. That is good for capitalists. That is good for profit. I mean, if we're thinking of profit rate, profit as a share of capital invested, that is the way forward. So it is not just good for what is good for workers is also good for the capitalists. So clearly, this is a time for a new economic model. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that response. If I may just come here to, say just a couple of things to building on what you said. It's interesting that over the high growth decade, which is supposed to be kind of the prime period for India's development, etc., what's really happening is also that we are moving increasingly. So basically, if in the entire informal sector, you have certain micro enterprises, which let's say employ wage worker and are relatively higher productive, have high technology, vis-a-vis, let's say we have another sector, which is the majority of the informal sector, where there's no wage worker. It's basically family-based production using unpaid household helpers. That the kind of accumulation possibilities that the former set has, the micro enterprises vis-a-vis this, has become even more widened and deepened. So this is something that I do in my research, and that is something that we need to recognize, that this kind of homogenizing of the economic structure towards this transition that we talk about, that's kind of become even more questionable over the high growth decade. So unless there is some active policy intervention or other ways to actively dilute that gap, that's not happening, at least as a general process of organic growth unfolding, or the kind of growth process that we've been in. That's not what seems to be happening. And interestingly, what's happening in when we talk about releasing constraints, one of the main features is supposed to be the subcontracting linkages, where you link these smaller informal enterprises with the larger enterprises. So what I do in my research is basically look at the subcontracting linkages in the informal manufacturing sector, and the firms that are subcontracted are doing way, way, way worse than the ones which are non-subcontracted. And over time, this has become, over the high growth decades in India, this has become even worse. What is happening is just a classic putting out system of production, where these people are given raw materials, they have to manufacture something out of it using household tools and supply it back to the parent firm or the contractor. So that's kind of the reality numbers of economy looks like. So thanks a lot. I think we'll just take a couple of last questions before we go to the panelists for final comments and round up the discussion. There's an interesting point made by Sridhar NS, who's arguing that given that employment levels among educated youth is very high, while education, healthcare, childcare, and environment protection services suffer from lack of deployment of personnel, is it not obvious that employing more youth in these activities would solve multiple problems simultaneously? So it's like a demand and supply match that we kind of need to look at. And there is another question by Judith here to Arindam. So Arindam, I'll come to you for this. It would be good if COVID crisis led to more serious discussions on the problem of migrant work. Interesting to hear that areas that were used to be receiving migrant employed more local people at higher wages. So could this tightening up of the conditions, probably in the labor market of migrant workers, reduce migration? And could this in fact be healthy? And I'll add one final question, which any of the panelists, while I come to them for their final comments, can respond to, which is by Vijay Raj, who's asking, why has the real national income decreased so much, even though the government did give out food to the tune of 20,000 crores to the people, especially in rural areas? So maybe I'll come to Dr. Das for these questions, and also for the final comments, after which I'll go to the next two panelists for the final comments. Thank you.
So what in the areas where there's migrant workers who goes to the Delhi or any other cities, what we have observed that they returned and they are working with a much lower than the wages, much lower than the prevailing wage rates. But it is not that the migrant worker receiving a higher wages in the villages. So because there is a surplus labor in most of the villages, what we have observed, the surplus labor are working with a much lower than the prevailing wage rates in the villages. Whereas in the village where the workers migrate, are these villages, because of the scarcity of labor, they are working they are not getting cultivators are not getting workers, so they need to hire they are hiring workers from the in the village or neighboring village, getting much higher wages. But it's not that migrant workers is receiving higher wages. So that's how we have observed in the data. This is the
Okay, thanks a lot. I guess, so any other final comments before I go to the other panelists for their comments? Dr. Das, any final comments from you?
no.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for this very insightful discussions. I'll go to Dr. Singh, where the last question that I'll put to you is by Bijay Raj, who's asking, why has the real national income decreased so much, even though the government did give out food to the tune of 20,000 crores to people, especially in the rural areas? And with that, could you also please give your final comments?
Yeah. So national wealth, of course, increased, and whatever we now seeing the negative, growth of the economy, etc. For various reasons of the impact of the lockdown on various productive activities, other than those who were considered essential activities. Entire manufacturing and all the major like construction, transport, etc. sectors were shut down, etc. So there are of course like these long-term and short-term economic implications of this kind of catastrophe. The final comment from my side would be that one of the among various other demands for a post-COVID 19 post-COVID phase would be that we need to also raise the issues, like we all have to be like watchful of the serious implementation and enforcement of basic labor laws. Now given the changes in the labor laws, etc., but the basic labor laws of making of timely payments, like for example what we found in our survey, that more than 50% of the workers were not paid at the time of the lockdown. So that is something which they had their pending dues, not only like those who worked on monthly basis, but even the daily wage earners had thousands and thousands of rupees due with their employers. So this kind of holding of the daily wages or the monthly wages for such a long time also indicates that there is a huge large scale violation of basic labor laws and labor practices at this informally this kind of employment, and where they are hired. So I would like to also recommend that a better implementation and more like serious enforcement of these practices where workers are paid their timely wages. So that is something which I would like to in what I have already said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh. I know this was your final comment, but we have a very interesting question that I would really like to pose you at the last. And thanks a lot for raising those points. But just one question by Professor Oshikawa, who's asking, I would like to know, how did the households that are fully or mostly dependent on remittances from migrant family workers at the time of the lockdown and immediately after, is there any example to show the impact on their living standards, such as food intake, education, consumption of essential items, and so on?
Yeah, I mean that's yes. Like there's some data available through independent studies and media reports. We of course like need more evidence to actually like gauge like what happened to to people, those who were dependent on migrant remittances, etc. But yes, like the preliminary evidence suggests that there was a huge decline in the food intake, in attainment of education institutes, because a lot of workers pulled out their wards from the schools, as they could not pay the fees. Also that they had they needed somebody an additional member to contribute to the household income. So a lot of child labor, cases of child labor etc. increased. The serious compromise with with medicines, the basic necessities, come under, certain, serious curtailments, and the cuts were, whatever we know as of now, there, some of these basic necessities were severely compromised by the workers and their families who were dependent on their earnings.
Thank you very much. And just to kind of add a little bit to that, something that, again, similar findings from our survey as well, that if you control for all other social and economic characteristics as well, the people who were migrant workers actually reported a higher food insecurity in terms of their households having to decrease consumption levels as a result of the lockdown. So thank you very much, Dr. Singh, and for bringing up this very important point of labor laws, which increasingly in our country is moving towards more dilution when we should be going in the opposite direction. So thanks a lot. I'll finally come to Professor Thomas for last and final comments on the panel, and just to address this question of taxation and whether if we tax the rich higher, wouldn't that then decrease the employment that they'll generate because their capacity will be lessened? With that and your final comments, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Surbhi. Just a small comment on the question on the national income. As I mentioned in my presentation, I made some estimates. I made some estimates on incomes lost by the vulnerable section, not all workers, the vulnerable section of India's workforce during the 2 months of the lockdown. So only during the 2 months of the lockdown. So that itself amounted to rupees 4 lakh crores, or that is rupees 4 trillion rupees, which is almost 2% of the national income. So I do not think that, any of the assistance, of course, the government has offered assistance, but I do not think that the assistance offered by the government, it has not matched the kind of loss that has happened in the economy, the income loss that has happened in the economy. So this is just the income loss, wage incomes loss in the economy, but definitely there's much more amount of losses that can be estimated. So that is why we find, national income, declining. Now, the growth is declining now. So clearly, therefore, that requires intervention. Now, on the question of young workers, yes, it's a very interesting point, and like I was trying to mention in my presentation, the employment growth in India in the period after 2012. One feature of this employment growth is that it employed more older workers. In fact, men aged 30 plus. So those who were affected by this were the younger workers, mainly those who are less than 30 years. And I think that should be also looked at in the larger context of the demographic, the window of opportunity that India has. One may actually say that we know this is a country whose working age population is still increasing, but not for long. In fact, I think increasingly India is facing the prospect of growing old before getting rich. So we really have a few years, perhaps a few, not many decades, a very few years in which our population will be relatively young, after which our population will actually start growing old. Look at East Asian countries and China. They actually benefited the most. Their economic growth was fastest during their period when the working age population was growing. I mean, they actually managed to make the best of the demographic window of opportunity. So it will be tragic for India if India is not able to do this. So clearly, yes, both supply and demand. There have to be interventions on education and health so that our population is not just young, but they are also educated, healthy, and skilled. That's a supply intervention, but clearly also demand side interventions make sure that there are employment opportunities which require skilled workers, which are which generate high quality employment, decent employment opportunities for India's young population. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much for those comments. They're very important and interesting, things that we need to keep in mind while designing any sort of policy response. It has been a very interesting panel, and we've actually run out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas, Dr. Singh, and Dr. Das, and FAS for organizing this discussion and for inviting me to chair it. It has genuinely been a stimulating conversation and discussion that I would like to continue going forward as well. I'll just leave this panel with 3 or 4 statistics to end this discussion because we are talking about informality. Let's remember this, that by December 2020, which was this last available data that we have from CMI, 39% of salaried workers continued in salaried work. 17% withdrew from workforce, 44% moved into informal forms of employment, mainly self-employment. And 68% of the workers experienced fall in their earnings between the pre-lockdown months of December 2019 and the post-lockdown month of 2020, and the median fall in earnings was 26%. Now, this in fact translated to a high inequality, where what happened is the relative loss for the bottom 10% of our population was 2.7 times larger compared to the overall average loss. So it's the bottom percent who, in proportional terms, is in fact losing out more, and that's not a mean thing. In terms of Professor Thomas just talked about the crisis of nutrition and the crisis of learning that we're kind of facing at the moment. And what is really astonishing is that in the middle of all this, the kind of expenditure that, that the budget allocated to ICDS, which is the umbrella scheme under which a lot of the, other kind of nutrition related schemes come as a part of it, midday meals, etc. There was, I think, from some figures that Professor Jean J had given, it was almost a 36% reduction in real terms. And that is not the kind of budget, and that's not the kind of policy making we should be looking at this very critical juncture. So thank you very much for joining the panel, and thank you, FAS, for organizing this.
Thank you, Surbhi. On behalf of Pandemic Studies Unit, I'd like to take this opportunity to make one point, particularly the question on Surbhi about that wheat harvesting and the market arrival. What actually our survey, what we found, particularly when we did our rabies assessment survey in month of April, May, what we found that because the wheat harvesting was done by mostly the machinery, so it was not much affected in terms of the harvesting operation. But what was more about that key, the prices is totally collapsed, the market prices. And more important that we have found that other than the two state, particularly the state which led by the state support, where the wheat prices in Punjab and the rice price in Kerala, except these two states, all the states, the major for the major products and the prices are totally collapsed. I think in the time of where the farmers, there's agitation is going on, and there's a movement in throughout the India in Delhi. I think it's a very important point, even in the time of pandemic, how these state institutions are very important for the in terms of the to receive a fair price. So, not going on at the end, in behalf of Pandemic Studies Unit, I would like to extend my thanks all the panelists and the chairs of this panel discussion. And I also thanks to all the participants for attending session. I would also take this opportunity to thanks Rosa Luxemburg-Stephen for continuous supporting our work, and especially for supporting the Pandemic Studies Unit. I would like to express my special thanks to the FAS online team, especially Mihira, Divya, Shudha, Nupur, Sandipan from FAS, Hitesh, which just finished our internship here, Bignesh from Free Software Movement, Karnataka, for conducting this program very smoothly. I request all the participants in here, please follow our FAS web page or social media accounts, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to get updates on the work under Pandemic Studies Unit, and also in general the works on the Agrarian Studies. As Sandipan mentioned earlier, that we have developed a web page of FAS Pandemic Studies Unit, where all the results, all the information we collect one place. I would request all please visit to our Pandemic Studies web page to get the updates. Thank you all.
photographs.
Yes, we're making everyone a panelist now. I request everyone to kindly stay on for 2 more minutes while we take a screenshot with everyone. I request everyone who've been promoted to panelists to please turn on their videos so that we can take a screenshot if your internet allows you to do that.
One thing actually I must apologize to the participants. Many of the questions we have not able to accommodate because of the short of time. So we'll try to address through the post question by sending the mail. Thank you.
So we've taken the screenshot. So I thank everyone for attending today's panel, and we'll be concluding the event now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.